In the heart of the city, amidst the pulsating life and bright lights, there was a small cafe, a refuge from chaos, where time seemed to stand still. This place, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and pastries, beckoned old friends and couples in love. The sounds of whispers and quiet laughter created a cozy atmosphere, as if each guest was a part of something bigger, important and dear. This morning was especially quiet. Marianne, a well-known activist and the wife of an influential politician, chose this cafe for a short break from her worries. Sitting by the window, she watched the passers-by, their faces full of hope and aspiration, and thought about the upcoming speech, where she was going to talk about human rights and equality. Every sip of her tea brought comfort, and thoughts about her important mission filled her heart with pride. However, in a dark corner of the cafe, immersed in his gloomy thoughts, sat a man who aroused no interest in anyone. He was alone, but his gaze was full of hatred. This man, poisoned by prejudice and stereotypes, was a racist who built a wall of hatred around himself, enveloping him from the inside. He had grown up in an environment where differences were perceived as threats, and this had left deep scars in his mind. When his gaze accidentally fell on Marianne, sitting by the window, a storm of emotions flared up inside him. She was black, and this was the spark that ignited his rage. Hatred filled his heart like corrosive acid, causing a storm of envy and contempt. He did not realize that his anger was not only hatred for her, but also a reflection of his own failures. Suddenly, on impulse, he stood up, clutching a cup of hot coffee. A moment froze in the air as he, like a puppet driven by evil, threw the cup towards Marianne. The water from the cup spurted out, burning her skin, leaving behind not only burns but also shock that pierced the atmosphere of the cafe. Screams and explosions of surprise were heard all around. The faces of the customers turned pale, while the barista dropped the coffee pot, his eyes wide with horror. This moment of chaos became a prologue to events that would forever change the lives of everyone present. What happened next? What consequences awaited this man who let go of his hatred? And how will Marianne cope with this sudden outburst of aggression? Write in the comments what your name is and where you are watching this video from. Your opinion is important to us. Your support helps promote our channel and make such important stories available to everyone. We appreciate each of you. Enjoy watching. The morning at the small corner cafe was filled with warm light coming through the large windows, decorated with green plants and wooden tables. The cafe attracted regulars with its cozy atmosphere. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the delicate notes of freshly baked buns. There were happy voices as couples discussed the upcoming weekend. Friends laughed at old jokes, and pensioners eagerly exchanged news. Every morning, many people gathered here, creating a unique community where everyone knew each other. A woman sat at one of the tables, carefully choosing what to order. Her smile was confident, and she was visible, like a star in this small world. She was the wife of a famous politician, and her eyes showed strength. Her stylish outfit attracted attention, but did not cause envy, rather, admiration. Outside, people were hurrying about their business, but here in the cafe, time passed slowly. Every moment seemed important, as if this place could become a safe haven from the bustle of the big city. But beneath the surface of this idyll, tensions were building that no one could have foreseen. One of the customers, sitting at a table in the corner, was casting disapproving glances at the woman. His expression was full of disdain. His gestures were aggressive. He did not belong to this world, and his hatred was growing fast, like storm clouds on the horizon. Amidst all the laughter and conversation, the mood began to change. Unbeknownst to those around them, a threat was in the air, and soon the world they knew would be destroyed by a single action. The light outside gradually changed, painting the cafe in warm shades of gold. At that moment, the door opened and a woman entered the room, attracting the attention of everyone present. It was Marianne, the wife of a famous politician, whose charisma and confidence made those around her freeze. She looked impeccable in a stylish dress that emphasized her figure, and her smile could brighten up even the cloudiest day. Her influence on society was undeniable. Marianne was active in charity projects, supported human rights initiatives, and advocated for equality. She knew how to deal with people and had the gift of inspiring them to action. In a cafe where acquaintances and like-minded people always gathered, Her appearance caused a wave of admiration and respect. She greeted several customers, exchanged pleasantries with the barista, who always tried to please her with the best coffee. Marianne knew how to find a common language with everyone, and this is what made her so popular. But today her thoughts were occupied by the upcoming elections and concerns about social inequality, which worried her most. Seeing a group of acquaintances approaching her, she smiled and politely accepted their greetings. The conversations filled the cafe with warmth, and everything seemed perfect. However, at a table in the corner, the racist, watching the scene, felt his irritation growing. His hatred for people different from him was boiling, and this only added fuel to the fire. Marianne was more than just a politician's wife. She was a symbol of change, a voice for those who could not speak. She knew she was attracting attention and critics, but that did not stop her. With every greeting and kind word, she asserted her position, and this power attracted not only friends but also enemies. All this created a unique atmosphere, where deep disagreements were hidden under the cover of friendship and smiles. For some, she was an idol, and for others, a target, and no one knew that this meeting would become the starting point for a terrible incident that would forever change the lives of everyone present. In the corner of the cafe, at a table hidden from public view, sat Victor, a middle-aged man with a stern face and furrowed brows. He looked unremarkable, but his presence radiated tension. Victor was one of those people who always looked for reasons to be angry. His life was full of disappointments, and he often blamed others for it, particularly those who were not like him. His worldview was tinged with prejudice, and with every sip of black coffee the hatred within him grew. He looked at Marianne with disdain, his mind filled with stereotypes and malicious prejudices. To him, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with society, a successful woman who, in his view, was getting everything on a silver platter simply because of her race. Victor grew up in a family where racism was the norm. His father constantly made derogatory remarks about people of other races, and Victor absorbed these ideas from an early age. With each passing year, the hatred grew deeper, turning him into a person who saw the world in black and white. He was lonely. His social circle was limited to people who were equally dissatisfied with him. When Victor came to the cafe, his goal was not just to drink coffee, but to find an object for his hatred. He enjoyed being able to voice his prejudices, especially in the presence of people he considered to be out of place. His inner voice told him that he was right, that he was defending his own from them. Now, watching Marianne, he felt his heart pounding with anger. Images appeared in his head that only fueled his hatred. He envied her success and influence, dreaming of how great it would be to humiliate her, to show everyone that he could prevail. This moment, when he decided that he had to act, became the culmination of his internal struggle. Around him, calm conversations, peaceful smiles continued, but he no longer felt part of this world. His only goal was to destroy this fragile balance that shone so brightly around Marianne. With each passing second, the hatred grew, and he prepared himself for his terrible act. Victor was sitting at a table, lost in his dark thoughts, when his attention was suddenly drawn to a figure entering the cafe. He looked up and saw Marianne. Her confident gait and shining smile seemed to illuminate everything around her. At that moment, the world around him froze. Her presence was so vivid that he couldn't look away. Marianne interacted with people, shared laughter, and it caused Victor to feel more than just irritation. At first it was a slight discontent, but then, like a black cloud, hatred enveloped him. A storm of thoughts began in his head, overlapping each other, creating a whole symphony of prejudice. Why is she here? Was the first question in his mind. Does she really think she can be like us? He felt his anger rising. His fingers began to tighten around the cup, and a voice inside him told him that she did not deserve the respect she was being shown. In his mind, Marianne became a symbol of everything he hated: successful, privileged people who, in his opinion, had never known true hardship. Victor remembered his father always saying that people like her never understand what it's like to struggle. That statement struck a chord with him, and he delved into his own childhood memories of how his parents had taught him to view people through the lens of color and class. With each new look at Marianne, his thoughts became more and more vicious. He hated her because she could allow herself to be free, because she was not afraid to express her opinion. A storm erupted in his imagination. Why should she get everything so easily? Why can she speak when others are silent? Victor felt his blood boil with rage, and this feeling became unbearable. A decision was maturing in his head. He had to stop her, humiliate her, prove that he was stronger. This first glance, which should have been neutral, turned into a confrontation that made his heart beat faster with anger. Every laugh, every friendly word she uttered became a challenge to him, and he prepared himself to strike back. A plan was forming in his mind that promised him short-term satisfaction, but with each passing second it seemed more and more like a catastrophe. Victor sat at the table, clutching a cup of coffee, and his thoughts returned to the past. He could not get rid of the memories that, like tenacious roots, entwined his consciousness. As a child, he often heard his father's words, full of hatred and prejudice. His father did not hide his views, and these ideas became part of Victor's upbringing. Every Sunday, he and his father would gather around the television, watching the news. "Look at how they all act," his father would say, pointing at the screen with disdain. "They'll never make it. It's not for them." Victor absorbed these words like a sponge, shaping his worldview. Over time, hatred became an integral part of his identity. He recalled how at school his friends would sometimes make jokes about the others. This created a sense of belonging to a group, and Victor did not want to be an exception. Instead of challenging these jokes, he laughed along with them, perpetuating stereotypes. He did not realize that by maintaining such an atmosphere, he was moving away from humanity and closer to prejudice. Over the years, his hatred only deepened. He worked in a low-paying job, and his colleagues often discussed problems that touched on racial issues. Instead of opening up to new ideas, Victor became increasingly closed. He learned that us was always better than them, and this gave him some illusory strength. Now, when he looked at Marianne, it seemed to him that she represented everything he hated. She was the bright spot in his gray background of life, where he felt lost and a failure. In his mind, a conspiracy of hatred snowballed. "I have to do something to show everyone that they can't feel better." He remembered how he once had an idea to unite people like himself. Victor dreamed of groups that would resist changes in society, of rallies where they could express their discontent. These thoughts embodied his loneliness, and he sank deeper into them, finding solace in the beliefs that fueled his hatred. Every angry glance at Marianne strengthened his resolve. He had to regain control, to take back what he thought was lost. Hatred surrounded him like an ominous ghost, and he knew he was ready to act now. A plan formed in his mind that would be the culmination of his inner struggle and hatred, the culmination he had been waiting for all his life. The moment Victor uttered his insulting words, the world around him seemed to freeze. He did not hear the whispers of indignation, did not notice the looks of shock and condemnation. His emotions overwhelmed him, and, overcome with rage, he could not stop. It was not just a desire to humiliate, it was a desire for revenge for all the grievances that had accumulated in his soul. The seconds seemed like an eternity, and a storm of thoughts rushed through his head. He felt the adrenaline filling his body. His heart was beating like crazy, and his breathing became heavy. Victor realized that this moment was his chance. He could not afford to back down, otherwise all this hatred he had would turn against him. Suddenly his eyes caught the cup of hot coffee on the table next to him. As if it was preordained, his hand reached out to it. Different feelings were fighting inside him. Growing hatred, the desire to punish, and, to some extent, fear of what he was about to do. But at that moment, fear gave way to mad determination. Victor grabbed the cup, his hands shaking with excitement, and the thoughts swirled in his head. Now I'll show her what it means to be in her place. His intention turned into action, and he abruptly threw the hot coffee in Marianne's direction. The water seemed to splash and sting her face, and screams of horror and shock echoed throughout the cafe. At that moment, Victor felt satisfaction mixed with adrenaline. He saw her eyes widen in surprise, her smile disappear, replaced by an expression of pain and confusion. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. The realization was growing inside him that he had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The blow he had dealt had not just affected her physically, it had revealed his inner emptiness, his loneliness and inability to understand what he was doing. At the same moment, his eyes met the gaze of the other customers, who were beginning to stand up, horrified by what was happening. Events unfolded so quickly that Victor didn't have time to realize that he had provoked not only hatred but also harsh condemnation. His own hatred turned against him, and he felt the pressure building. At that moment, fear finally broke through the curtain of his rage, and he froze, not knowing what to do next. The coffee spilled on Marianne, burning her face, and in that moment the world around her turned into chaos. She felt the hot liquid quickly burn her skin, and pain pierced every cell of her body. Her first reaction was instantaneous. Instinctively she covered her face with her hands, trying to stop this flow of hatred. Amid the shouts and angry whispers that echoed around her, her inner world seemed to freeze. She couldn't believe that this was happening in the cafe where she always felt safe. The looks of shock and condemnation from other people didn't help her. Instead, they only increased her sense of isolation. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back. Marianne did not want to show weakness, even though the rage and humiliation inside her fought with her determination. She knew she had to show everyone that she would not allow herself to be humiliated. This was her moment, and she could not let it pass. As if in slow motion, she looked up at Victor, who stood there, spellbound, with his mouth open, not understanding what he had done. Fear and bewilderment flickered in his eyes, and Marianne suddenly realized he did not know what he was up against. She was not just a woman he wanted to humiliate, she was a voice, a symbol of the fight for rights and justice. The people around her began to react. Groups of people jumped up from their seats, some screamed, some rushed to her aid. One of the customers hurried to the bar to get a towel, another tried to call the police. Marianne heard their words, but they were distant to her, as if she were underwater. As someone covered her face with a towel, she felt her emotions burst forth. Fear and anger mixed with disgust at the situation she had been forced into. Her heart was beating fast, and despite the pain, she felt a surge of strength. "I will not remain silent," she thought, trying to gather her thoughts. Meanwhile, Victor, realizing what he had done, began to back away, as if fear had spurred him to flee. He felt the gaze of others falling upon him, and this feeling of condemnation became more and more unbearable. The understanding arose in his mind that he had become an object of contempt, and not the hero of his own design. Marianne, gathering her strength, stood up, her eyes flashing. She couldn't let this moment be about hate alone. She wanted his action to be a lesson to everyone in the cafe. Her voice was firm, even through the noise and excitement. "This is unacceptable. We cannot allow hate to rule our lives." The phrase, spoken with force and feeling, echoed throughout the room, and there were notes of struggle in it. At that moment, Marianne understood that her fight was just beginning, and she was ready to fight hatred, despite everything that had happened. The cafe instantly turned into an arena of chaos and confusion. The noisy conversation that had just filled the space suddenly stopped. All eyes turned to Marianne, whose face was etched with pain and shock. People who had just been enjoying their time now sat dumbfounded and unable to believe their eyes. Some of the customers stood up, trying to figure out what had happened. A woman in the corner, holding a cup of tea, screamed and jumped back, as if the coffee might burn her too. A man in a business suit, noticing that Marianne needed help, quickly ran up to her with a towel. His hands were shaking, but he tried to speak to her in a soothing tone. "Everything will be fine, we will help you now." From the other side of the room, someone shouted, "Call the police," and this provoked even more chaos. People started talking, some tried to record the incident on their phones, while others could only watch the events with their mouths open. But amidst the general shock and worry, there were those who stood aside, doing nothing. They looked at each other, as if seeking confirmation that they were not alone in their feelings. Fear of possible consequences stopped them. What to do in such a situation? Intervene or stay away? This internal conflict created immobility. Victor, who had been the source of this terror in the first place, now seemed to have disappeared. He felt the gazes of those around him burning into him, and, overcome with fear, he staggered backwards until he fell into a chair, clutching his hands to his face. Voices were ringing in his mind. "What have you done? How could you?" Meanwhile, discontent was growing in the cafe. Some began shouting threats and reproaches at Victor, others stood up for Marianne, reminding everyone that hatred had no place in their society. "We must be united against this," one of the men shouted, raising his fist in the air. These words filled the atmosphere with anger and determination. More and more people approached Marianne, offering her help, trying to calm her down. Someone handed her a bottle of water, another a mobile phone so she could call someone for support. Marianne, confused but full of determination, felt that she was not alone, that there were people around her who were ready to support her in this difficult moment. Shock slowly turned to anger, and soon the room was filled with discussions about hate and what had happened. People began to discuss the importance of fighting bias, calling for action. This situation became a turning point not only for Marianne, but for everyone in the room, and while the moment was horrific, it also became a catalyst for change about the importance of not standing by while someone suffers from hate. The atmosphere in the cafe gradually changed. The shock that had previously reigned among the customers began to develop into confusion. People exchanged glances, and in their eyes one could read the questions. What to do? And how could this happen? Some were afraid, and this feeling involuntarily pushed them to stay away. Mariana, wiping her face with a towel, tried to come to her senses. Her heart was pounding and her thoughts were confused. She felt like they were looking at her, and the realization that she had been humiliated in front of everyone weighed on her like a heavy weight. But at the same time, she was surrounded by people who were ready to support her. Among them was a young woman with bright hair who couldn't hold back her tears. She came closer, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. It's terrible." She hugged Marianne, trying to convey her support. This gesture, filled with sincerity, gave Marianne strength, and she felt that she was not alone in her struggle. However, not everyone was ready to act. Some visitors continued to sit in their seats, staring at their phones or looking at the floor, as if hoping that everything would soon resolve itself. Fear of possible consequences, fear of becoming a victim of hatred similar to that which Marianne faced, paralyzed their actions. They preferred to remain in their cozy comfort zone, refusing to interfere with what seemed too difficult and dangerous. In the corner of the cafe, a group of young people were talking about what had happened, but their conversation was full of misunderstanding. "Is it really that important?" one of them asked, hardly understanding the scale of what had happened. This caused indignation among the people who were trying to support Marianne. "Yes, it is important. Hatred is not normal," someone shouted, responding to the indifference. Tension and anger were in the air. Some people took pictures of the incident, not realizing that they were turning a human tragedy into a spectacle. This only made the atmosphere worse, and Marianne felt even more vulnerable, as if her pain had become an object of discussion. Meanwhile, the man who had tried to help Marianne earlier approached her again. His face was serious. "We need to call the police. This is wrong, and he needs to be held accountable." Marianne nodded, her voice barely audible, but she understood that this was a step towards justice. She felt how fear and confusion began to dissipate, giving way to determination. Some people started to support the idea. Soon, several people gathered around, discussing what to do next. It was amazing. Instead of staying on the sidelines, they started to act. Fear turned into a desire to unite and confront hatred. The atmosphere in the cafe began to change. Fear gave way to shared determination, and Marianne felt that her voice, despite everything, still had power. Within a few hours of the incident, news of the cafe incident began to spread across social media and news channels. The video of the moment when Victor poured hot coffee on Marianne went viral. The headlines were shocking and provocative. "Racism in the city center. Woman doused with coffee in front of everyone." And "Hate that burns. Cafe incident sparks public outrage." The media immediately began covering the events. Reporters rushed into the cafe, asking questions of witnesses and asking customers for comments. People who had previously preferred to remain on the sidelines were now under pressure to share their impressions and observations. Camera flashes and microphones aimed at them created an atmosphere full of tension and excitement. Public opinion was divided. Many expressed their support for Mariana, praising her courage and determination. A lively debate began on social media, with users posting with hashtags like #StopRacism and #JusticeForMariana, calling for action against racism and hatred. People shared their stories of discrimination and expressed hope that such an incident would lead to change. However, not everyone responded to the call for unity. Some commentators tried to justify Victor's behavior, portraying him as a victim of circumstances and emphasizing that perhaps he simply lost control in the moment. These opinions sparked heated debates online, with many wondering how such behavior could be justified. Meanwhile, journalists began to spin Victor's personality. As it turned out, he had a history of conflicts and had repeatedly gotten into trouble. This only added fuel to the fire. He has problems with the law, hatred that breeds violence. Local activists organized rallies in support of Mariana, demanding stricter measures against racism and hatred in society. Marianne, following the news, had mixed feelings. She realized that her story had become a symbol of the fight against bias, but she was also afraid that her personal tragedy could be used in political games. The fear of publicity weighed on her, and she could not shake the feeling that her whole life was now a subject of discussion. However, her determination did not wane. Marianne knew that this event could be a catalyst for change. She decided to make a statement to express her thoughts and feelings about what had happened, calling people to action. On social media, she wrote, "I will not let hate define me. We must unite against racism and learn to love each other despite our differences." Her words quickly spread across the internet, inspiring others to do the same. The incident in the cafe, which began as an act of hate, turned into a powerful message about the need to fight bias. Public opinion continued to change, and everyone realized that this story was just beginning. The incident in the cafe caused a storm of reactions not only on social networks, but also in political circles. Politicians and public activists began to unite to condemn Victor's actions and emphasize the need to protect the rights of victims of racist attacks. On the same day that news of the incident went viral, several prominent politicians came forward with statements. Their rhetoric was determined to change the situation. One local senator, speaking to cameras, said, "We can no longer turn a blind eye to racism. It is a crime that requires our attention and action. We must protect those who fall victim to hate and create a safe society for all." Many activists who have long fought against racism and discrimination also responded to the incident. They organized rallies and protests, calling on people to support the victim and speak out against hatred. The slogans on the posters read, "Hate has no place in our society, and protecting the rights of victims is our duty." In this context, Marianne, who was first and foremost a woman who had experienced violence, suddenly became a symbol of the fight against bias. Her story inspired many, and she became the face of new initiatives aimed at supporting victims of racism. Activists began to raise funds for her defense, and lawyers offered their services for free to help her in a possible trial. Meanwhile, a debate was unfolding on social media about the need for stricter laws against racist crimes. People were demanding that the government take steps to strengthen the legislation to prevent such incidents from happening again. Politicians, feeling the public pressure, began drafting new bills aimed at protecting the rights of victims and creating tougher penalties for perpetrators of hate crimes. Marianne, who hadn't expected her story to become so significant, realized that this was her chance to make an impact. She agreed to speak at rallies and participate in interviews to spread her story and call for change. Her voice grew louder and clearer, sharing her thoughts on the importance of uniting against hatred, speaking out about our experiences, and supporting each other. Meanwhile, Victor remained in the shadows, his fear of repercussions and public condemnation growing. He saw the campaign unfolding around him, and he knew that his actions had catalyzed change he could never have imagined. Marianne's advocacy had led to a public conversation about racism, and his name would forever be associated with that movement. Marianne, realizing the power of her voice, continued to fight for justice, gaining confidence in her actions and becoming a true symbol of hope and strength. Society was finally starting to wake up and realize the importance of fighting hatred, which couldn't help but make her happy. In the wake of the cafe incident, Marianne not only became the face of the fight against racism, but also found support from people she never expected to see in that arena. These unexpected allies came from all walks of life, and their support greatly strengthened her spirit and resolve. Among them was an elderly woman named Eliza Beta, a longtime activist. Eliza Beta, who had a background in human rights, learned about what had happened and immediately decided to support Marianne. At one of the rallies organized in her defense, she gave a moving speech. "I have seen how hate has destroyed lives for many years, but today we are here to say, this is not acceptable. We must all unite to protect those who suffer from bias," she said, drawing applause from the crowd. This speech inspired many, and soon other activists whom Marianne had not known before joined the movement. Young students from different universities began organizing campaigns to raise awareness about racism, holding classes and seminars aimed at educating young people about the importance of tolerance. Their enthusiasm and fresh perspective on the issue gave the movement new strength. One of the local businessmen unexpectedly joined in, Daniel, the owner of a successful cafe who had long avoided politics. He felt he could no longer stand by while his community suffered from hatred. Daniel organized special events at his establishment aimed at raising funds to support Marianne's legal expenses. He opened the doors of his cafe to activists, giving them a space to discuss and plan their next steps. The initiative attracted the attention of local media, which further lifted Marianne's spirit. She realized that people of different ages and professions were uniting for one purpose: to combat bias. At one of the events organized by Daniel, Marianne spoke and shared her story, inspiring others to share their experiences. Marianne was also joined by people working in law enforcement. Several police officers who knew about what had happened decided to speak out against racism within their ranks. One of them, Sergeant Liam, publicly acknowledged that racism is not just an issue for victims, it is also an issue for those who work in law enforcement. "We have to work on ourselves to change and help our communities," he said at a press conference, drawing support and encouragement from his colleagues. This support from unexpected allies created a powerful flow of energy that only strengthened Marianne's resolve. She couldn't believe that her story could unite such different people. This new wave of support led to the creation of a coalition that united activists, businessmen, and even law enforcement officials. Photos and videos of the events began appearing on social media, with people holding signs with messages like "United Against Hate" and "Every Voice Counts." The images spread, gathering more and more supporters. Marianne became a symbol of unity and strength, showing that the fight against racism is a common cause. Each new speech and event only strengthened her belief that change was possible. She realized that together with her unexpected allies, they could create a society free of bias and hatred. Support from people she never expected to see along the way only confirmed that the fight for justice is a common cause that requires everyone to participate. After the incident in the cafe, when Marianne became a symbol of the fight against racism, public unrest began to grow. Reaching its peak, rallies and protests filled the streets of the city, turning discontent into a powerful movement that demanded change. The first protests attracted a large number of people, from students to pensioners, from activists to ordinary citizens, who came to express their indignation. Posters with slogans such as "Say No to Racism" and "We Demand Justice" were held by citizens who were not going to stand aside. The protests were organized not only in the city center, but also in areas where residents had previously avoided discussing such topics. This was an important moment when people began to openly talk about their feelings, experiences and fears. The situation was heating up. Amidst the growing unrest, some groups began to provoke conflicts. Members of radical organizations opposed to the protesters tried to destabilize the atmosphere by inciting violence. They showed up at events with posters promoting hatred and misunderstanding, which only added to the tension. One day, during a peaceful rally, a small group of opponents began to provoke, shouting insults at the participants. The atmosphere quickly changed. First there were shouts, Then the crowd split into two parts, and soon a scuffle broke out between them. The police, who had previously supported the protesters, were forced to intervene to break up the clashes. This created the impression that the conflict was only escalating, and the peaceful demonstration turned into chaos. During this time, the media actively covered the events, emphasizing both the positive and negative aspects of the protests. Reports on the rally showed both the strength and unity of citizens and the increase in violence. This only contributed to further division of opinion in society. Some supported the protesters, praising their courage and determination, while others condemned them for their radical methods and escalation of the conflict. Marianne watched the events, feeling both pride in the strength shown by the protesters and fear of the possible consequences of violence. She understood that many people came to the rallies to express their opinions, but she also realized how easy it was to lose control and turn a peaceful protest into riots. Her determination to stand up for justice became more and more important. Activists like Eliza Beta and Daniel began calling for more constructive action. They met to discuss how to avoid escalation and how to ensure the safety of participants. As a result, a plan was developed to organize peace days of action where protesters could demonstrate their discontent without violence or provocation. Despite attempts to establish dialogue, the discontent and tension did not go away. The conflict flared up beyond the city, spreading to neighboring regions, where people also began to take to the streets demanding change. The movement became national, and soon various groups, organizations, and local communities began to collaborate, joining forces to combat racism. Meanwhile, the authorities began to realize that the situation was getting out of control. Realizing the need for action, they began working on new initiatives aimed at peacefully resolving the conflict and restoring trust in law enforcement. However, each new step only added new layers of tension to an already difficult situation. Mariana, speaking at one of the rallies, urged all those gathered to stay strong and focus. "We must remember what we are fighting for. Our goal is not hatred, but love and understanding. We must unite to overcome this division," she said, evoking support and unity among the participants. Social unrest was becoming more and more visible, but so was the hope for change. Marianne knew that the fight was just beginning, and that every day was a new step towards a brighter future. After the incident in the cafe, Marianne's life changed forever. The shock of what happened was a real test for her. She felt fear and anxiety fill her every thought. The first days after the incident were especially difficult. Every morning she woke up with a feeling of anxiety that gripped her heart. Marianne often looked back when she went out into the street, as if she expected someone to attack her again. She began to avoid public places where she used to feel confident. The cafe where the incident took place became a symbol of pain and humiliation for her. The memory of hot coffee burning her skin did not leave her alone. Even simple actions, such as walking in the park or riding the bus, caused her to have panic attacks. Marianne's internal dialogue became dark. She asked herself questions like, "Why did this happen to me? And what's wrong with me?" These thoughts haunted her, making her feel isolated and misunderstood. Every mention of racism or violence in the news raised her anxiety, triggering memories of the trauma. Despite the support of friends and activists, she felt that no one could truly understand her suffering. Often, she would isolate herself and cry in the quiet of her apartment, trying to cope with her grief and hurt. Marianne knew that her experiences were important, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to be strong and show that she was coping. However, inside, she felt a growing sense of helplessness. Sleep problems became her constant companions. She tossed and turned in bed at night, tormented by nightmares in which she relived the incident over and over again. Every morning she began with fatigue and disappointment that she had not been able to rest. She tried to find solace in meditation and yoga, but this helped only for a short time. Her psychological state worsened, and she realized that she needed help. Eventually, Marianne decided to see a psychologist. The first visit was difficult. She was embarrassed to share her experiences and open up to a stranger. However, gradually, in an atmosphere of trust, she was able to talk about her fears and how the incident had changed her life. The psychologist helped her understand that her feelings were normal for a person who has experienced trauma. and that it was important to work through these emotions rather than hide them. Marianne began to realize that she needed not only forgiveness, but also healing. In sessions, she learned techniques for managing anxiety and coping with post-traumatic stress. She began writing down her feelings in a journal, which helped her release the accumulated stress. This process became therapeutic for her. Each time she wrote about her experiences, she felt a little better. Over time, Marianne realized that her experience could be a source of strength, not weakness. She decided to use her experiences to help others who were facing similar situations. Inspired by the support of the community, she began speaking at events, sharing her story and encouraging people to be open in discussing racism and violence. With each new performance, she felt her confidence grow. Marianne realized that she was not alone. Many people experience similar fears and traumas. This understanding helped her find her purpose and become a voice for those who cannot speak. Her passion for change and desire to protect the rights of others inspired her to continue the fight despite her own fears. Ultimately, though the incident left a deep mark on her, Marianne learned to find strength in vulnerability. She realized that her experiences could be a catalyst for the change she wanted to see in society. Her story went from being a personal tragedy to a powerful tool to combat bias and hatred, giving her hope for a better future. Victor's trial began a few months after the incident at the cafe, and it attracted the attention of not only local but also national media. As Marianne prepared for this important stage, she understood that this was not just a trial, but also an opportunity for her to tell her story and demonstrate the importance of fighting racism. The courtroom was crowded at the first hearing. Marianne had come with support. She was surrounded by activists, friends and even some strangers who had come to show solidarity. The press conferences and rallies had not gone unnoticed, and now everyone wanted to be a witness to the big moment. As soon as Marianne entered the courtroom, photographers and cameras turned their attention to her. It was both exciting and terrifying. She knew that her face would become a symbol of the fight. The judge opened the hearing and the proceedings began. Marianne's lawyer began by presenting evidence, CCTV footage from the cafe, witness statements and medical reports confirming the injuries she had sustained. Every time Victor's name was mentioned, the tension in the room was palpable. People were looking for justice, and this process was the only way to achieve it. When it came time for Victor to speak, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. He sat in the dock, looking confused and nervous. His lawyer tried to frame the situation in a way that would show that Victor's actions were provoked, but the defense was unconvincing. The public was determined. Marianne felt her heart pounding as Victor began to speak, justifying his actions. It only increased her desire to show that such biased thinking was unacceptable. With each hearing, the pressure on Victor increased. Protesters with signs stood outside the courthouse, demanding justice for Marianne and condemning racism. These demonstrations attracted public attention, with many expressing their opinions on social media. Marianne followed this and realized that her fight was becoming part of a much larger movement. During the trial, Marianne gave her testimony. It was one of the most difficult moments of her life. She sat in the witness box, and when her gaze met Victor's, she felt fear and anger overwhelm her. But despite this, she began to speak. With each sentence, her confidence grew. She described how the incident had changed her life, how fear and anxiety now accompanied her everywhere. Her words touched the hearts of those present. The judge, the lawyers, and even some members of the public listened with bated breath. Marianne spoke about how racism is not just a problem of isolated incidents. It is a systemic problem that affects many people. She called for justice, and her voice became a powerful manifesto for all those who suffered from bias. Following her testimony, the prosecutor presented additional evidence, including testimony from other customers at the cafe, who confirmed that Victor had acted with hatred and aggression. This only strengthened the prosecution's case. Marianne felt the weight of hope on her shoulders, and with each passing day of the trial, she became more determined. During the trial, there were conflicts and tense moments in the courtroom, when Victor tried to minimize his actions, accusing Marianne of provocation, but each time, his attempts to challenge the facts only caused more indignation from those present. Public opinion was unambiguous. Hatred cannot go unpunished. As the judge began to sum up the results, there was a tense silence in the courtroom. Everyone was waiting for a decision that could become a symbol of the fight against racism. Marianne kept her fists raised, knowing that this decision could change her life and the lives of many others. Ultimately, when the judge handed down the sentence, he confirmed that Victor's actions were intentional and biased. It was a powerful statement that racism and violence will not be tolerated in society. Tears of joy filled Marianne's eyes as she realized that her fight had not been in vain. This moment became a symbol of hope for many and a confirmation that change is possible when you fight for truth and justice. The trial left a deep mark not only on Marianne's life but also on society, forcing many to reflect on the moral dilemmas surrounding racism and hatred. Following the verdict, discussions on social media and public forums have prompted a rethinking of relationships between different groups and the understanding that every action has its consequences. Marianne, in her new role as a public figure, began to actively participate in the discussions. She knew that it was important not only to talk about hatred, but also to propose ways to change. One of the main issues that became the subject of discussion was the question of what the true meaning of racism is in our society. The discussion soon became a subject of debate not only in academic circles, but also in ordinary cafes where people gathered to discuss the events that had taken place. At one of the meetings at the community center, where people of different ages and nationalities gathered, Marianne spoke to the audience. She spoke about her experiences, about how hatred can destroy lives, but also emphasized the need to understand the roots of this hatred. We must ask ourselves where these feelings come from and how we can change them, she urged. This idea provoked many questions and discussions. One of the participants, a young woman named Lisa, raised her hand and asked a difficult question. What if hate comes from fear? How can we deal with people being afraid of new things? The question hung in the air, and the audience sat silent. Marianne knew that the answer was not simple, and that many of us face biases rooted in fear and ignorance. The discussion deepened and soon a moral dilemma emerged. How can we change if we ourselves are not aware that we carry stereotypes and preconceptions? Marianne spoke about how an important step towards change is self-awareness. We have to acknowledge our own shortcomings and biases. This does not mean that we are bad people. It means that we are people who are capable of change, she noted. The room filled with many voices discussing their own experiences. Some admitted to having experienced bias themselves, and that it made them question their own views. One older man spoke of how his children taught him openness and acceptance of diversity, and how he slowly but surely changed because of their lessons. This was an important point for everyone in the room. The understanding that change is possible if we are willing to work on ourselves. The meeting soon turned to other moral dilemmas related to the fight against racism. What to do when we see injustice but are afraid to intervene? What are the limits of our responsibility as citizens? These questions provoked deep reflection. Marianne emphasized the importance of not remaining indifferent. Each of us can take a step forward to create a more just society. If we do not remain silent, hatred cannot survive. The discussion continued late into the evening. People shared their stories, fears, and hopes. Some expressed frustration that the system sometimes protected the aggressors rather than the victims. Marianne felt that her own experiences, as well as those of others, were becoming a catalyst for change. She understood that it was necessary not only to talk about hatred, but also to offer concrete ways forward. This meeting was a milestone for many. People began to realize that change began with each of us, and that fighting racism was a long and difficult process. But together, they could create a society based on mutual understanding and respect. Marianne, feeling the power of a united voice, realized that they were ready for change. The process was just beginning, and she was ready to lead it forward. The road to recovery for Marianne did not start immediately. After the trial, which brought her relief but also new emotions, she realized that healing is a long and difficult process that requires time and effort. Every day was like a step along a path where she had to overcome not only physical but also psychological pain. The first step on this path was to contact a psychotherapist. Mariana found a specialist who helped her work through her traumas and fears. The first sessions were difficult. It was hard for her to share her experiences. However, with each meeting, she felt herself gradually opening up. The psychotherapist helped her understand her emotions, taught her to distinguish what was a reaction to stress and what was real fear. This understanding became an important tool in her healing. With each conversation, Marianne became more and more aware that her feelings were completely normal. She learned not only to cope with anxiety, but also to find joy in the little things in life. The therapist offered her meditation and mindfulness practices, which became a real salvation for her. Every morning, she set aside time for meditation to calm her mind and prepare herself for the day ahead. The support of her friends and family played an important role in her recovery. Her friend Lena became a real pillar of support. Lena invited Mariana on walks, organized meetings with other friends who supported her. These moments allowed her not only to distract herself, but also to feel that she was not alone. They walked in the park together, laughed, went shopping and simply enjoyed each other's company. Each such meeting helped Mariana overcome the feeling of isolation that arose after the incident. Mariana also found support in the activist community. She began to participate in human rights events, and with each new step she took, she felt her confidence grow. Meeting like-minded people gave her strength and inspiration. She realized that her experience could help others, and this gave her a new meaning in life. One day, at one of these events, she spoke in front of an audience, sharing her story. It was emotional, but she felt it was necessary, both for her and for others. However, the road to recovery was not always straight and easy. Marianne experienced relapses of anxiety and worry, especially when she was in crowded places or faced with situations that reminded her of the trauma. At such times, she sought comfort from friends and family. They were always there, ready to support her and remind her of how far she had come. Little by little, with the help of therapy and support from loved ones, Mariana began to find her strength. She began to do her favorite hobbies again, drawing and photography. These creative activities helped her express her emotions and experiences. Each drawing, each photograph became part of her healing process. She realized that creativity is a powerful tool that helps not only to forget about pain, but also to transform it into something positive. Marianne began blogging about recovery, fighting bias, and the importance of support. It became not only a therapeutic process, but also a way to connect with others who had gone through similar experiences. She found the feedback from readers inspiring, and felt that her experiences could be a guiding light for others dealing with trauma. Over time, Marianne realized that recovery was not just about going back to the way things were, but about becoming stronger and wiser. Every day, she became more confident, which gave her hope for a brighter future. Marianne realized that she was not just a victim, she was a survivor who was ready to fight for change and inspire others. Recovery became more than just a personal journey for her, it became a social movement. Not only did Marianne continue to work on herself, but she also actively encouraged others to talk about their experiences and seek support. She knew that together they could create a world free of hate and prejudice, and that was the most important achievement in her journey to healing. The incident at the cafe was not only a personal tragedy for Marianne, but also a landmark event that sparked public discussions about racism and bias. The lessons learned from this situation turned out to be important not only for her life, but for the entire society. The first important lesson was the realization that racism is not just an individual problem, but a systemic threat that affects many people. Marianne, sharing her story at events and on social media, began to explain how hatred can manifest itself in many different forms, from overt violence to subtle manifestations of bias. This understanding became the basis for a deeper analysis of the problems associated with racism in society. Marianne actively collaborated with human rights organizations that helped to spread information about racism and its consequences. Together they organized workshops and discussions where they talked about the importance of identifying and condemning racism in any form. One of the key topics was how we can change our perceptions, both at the level of personal beliefs and at the level of social structures. Another important lesson was the realization of the need for education and enlightenment. Marianne actively called for the implementation of programs aimed at combating bias in schools and universities. She believed that only through open discussion of these topics could a new generation be raised free from hatred and prejudice. Marianne organized workshops and trainings that taught children and young people to recognize racism and act against it. The incident also prompted a rethinking of policy and lawmaking. Marianne and her allies launched a campaign to toughen penalties for racial crimes. They collected signatures, organized rallies, and met with local authorities, calling for stricter measures against discrimination. This work attracted the attention of the media, and soon the issue of human rights protection became one of the main topics of public discussion. Marianne also realized that fighting racism required uniting different groups. She worked actively to create coalitions between different ethnic and cultural groups. The events brought people together to share their stories and experiences. This collaboration strengthened solidarity and showed that fighting racism is a common task that requires joint efforts. The lessons learned from the incident also touched on the issue of personal responsibility. Marianne inspired people to step out of their comfort zone and actively speak out against bias in their environment. She emphasized the importance of dialogue, which can lead to understanding and changing stereotypes. In her public speeches, she often reminded that everyone can be part of change if they do not remain indifferent. During her talks, Marianne often shared positive examples of communities coming together to confront racism. She talked about how neighbors stood up for each other, how schools implemented tolerance programs, and how companies took action against discrimination. These stories inspired people and showed that change is possible if everyone is willing to take responsibility. As Marianne continued her work, she saw that public perceptions of racism were indeed beginning to change. People were becoming more aware, willing to discuss uncomfortable topics, and committed to change. Marianne felt that her efforts had not been in vain, and that her personal story had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about human rights. Ultimately, the lessons learned from the incident became the foundation for deeper changes in society. Marianne realized that fighting racism is not just a momentary act, but an ongoing process that requires all of us to take action and be accountable. She was determined to continue this work, knowing that every step along the way brings society closer to a more just and equal future. Marianne's story became a symbol of hope and strength to overcome hatred and prejudice. Through pain and suffering, she not only found a path to healing, but also became an inspiration to many who were also facing difficulties. Every step she took, every speech, and every open discussion became part of a larger fight for human rights. Over time, her efforts began to bear fruit. Communities began to unite, forming coalitions to combat racism. Tolerance education programs became part of school curricula, and people began to speak openly about their experiences and fears. She saw changes beginning to happen, and it gave her the strength to continue. Marianne continued to blog, sharing not only her personal experiences but also the successes of others. Each new post attracted attention, and people from all over the country responded to her calls. She understood that together they could create a space where everyone would feel safe and respected. With each passing year, her work became more and more important. Marianne spoke at conferences, met with politicians and activists, trying to convey to everyone the importance of the fight against racism. She understood that this fight was not only her personal task, but also a public one, requiring joint efforts. By the end of her story, Marianne realized that she had not only survived trauma, but also found her calling. She had become a voice calling for change, and her story inspired thousands of people around the world. With each passing day, she felt that the world around her was changing, and that she had a part in that change. Marianne knew that the fight against racism was a never-ending journey, but now she had the strength and support to continue. She looked to the future with hope, believing that together they could build a world free of hatred and prejudice, a world where everyone was worthy of respect and love. This story ended, but its lessons lived on. inspiring new generations to fight for justice and equality. Every step along the way was important, and Marianne was ready to move on, knowing that change begins with each of us. Thank you for being with us in this story. We are very interested to know what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. Each of you is valuable and we are truly grateful for your support. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. Have a nice day and hope to see you again.